Thanks for coming, and we meet here every second Monday of the month. Just me to get it wrong. Tonight, anyway, we have a response to Walter Block's David Friedman and Libertarianism, a critique by Jan Lester.
Thank you. I'm going to get through roughly half of this, I hope. It's certainly too long for one talk, but I can't be quite sure where the break is, so we'll have to play it by ear. Abstract. David Friedman has posed a number of libertarian philosophical problems in his The Machinery of Freedom, 2nd edition. This essay criticises Walter Block's Rothbardian responses and defends J.C. Lester's critical rationalist libertarian theory responses. The main issues are as follows. 1, critical rationalism and how it applies to libertarianism. 2.1, how libertarianism is not inherently about law and is inherently about morals. 2.2, how liberty relates to property and can be maximised, carbon dioxide and radio waves. 2.3, applying the theory to flashlights, that's torches to Brits. 2.4, applying the theory to the probability of imposed risks. 2.5, homesteading or initial acquisition. 2.6, what is essential for a true libertarian. 2.7, crime and punishment. 2.8, extent of punishment. 2.9, the libertarian response to a madman with a gun. 2.10, how contradictions in rights are possible. 2.11, the draft. 3.1, utilitarianism and nose counting. 3.2, how interpersonal comparisons of utility are possible and utility monsters are not a threat. 3.3, why it is not utilitarian in practice to kill an innocent prisoner to prevent a riot. 3.4, why David Friedman should not be forced to give up one of his eyes. 3.5, how utilitarians can be libertarians, and conclusion, a proper theory of liberty combined with critical rationalism offer superior solutions to Friedman's problems. Overview. In Escape from Leviathan, I discussed some problems that David Friedman posed for libertarian philosophy in his Machinery of Freedom. In his David Friedman and Libertarianism, a critique, Walter Block also responded to the same arguments. Professor Block is a leading Rothbardian libertarian who has answers to Friedman that are significantly different from my own. The purpose of this paper is to offer a critical commentary on Block's responses to Friedman following his subheadings and to defend my own approach, but with occasional elaborations.
Right, is it possible?
Yes.
I can't hear you here.
You can, okay. Right. Sorry, at the back of the crowd. Block begins. There is not one philosophy of libertarianism, but rather there are two. And he cites the utilitarian and the deontological types. I am very happy to bring Professor Block the good news that there is at least one other philosophy of libertarianism. For in addition to any consequentialist philosophies, and I would not restrict these to utilitarianism in any of its flavours, and any deontological philosophies, and I would not restrict these to the Rothbardian Blockian one, there is also critical rationalist libertarianism, which does not base libertarianism on anything at all. For this view applies Karl Popper's extreme fallibilist epistemology of critical rationalism. Therefore, I shall begin by very briefly outlining both critical rationalism and how I take it to apply to libertarianism. According to critical rationalism, no theory or thesis, view, outlook, opinion, argument, proof, etc., can ever rule out the possibility of a refuting counter-instance or counter-argument, including critical rationalism itself, of course. With our finite and fallible reasoning facing the infinite world of unknown matter and theories, we never know what we might have overlooked. Therefore, theories cannot be justified, or supported, grounded, founded, based, backed, established, proven, etc., All theories remain conjectures or guesses, assumptions, suppositions, and so forth. We are obliged to use some conjectures for practical purposes and not always unrefuted conjectures, such as Newtonian mechanics. But the only epistemologically useful thing we can do with conjectures is to criticise or test them as best we can. If we cannot refute them, then they remain conjectures, but they might well be true, of course. If we can refute them, then we learn something new. Truth is what we are aiming at, but we can only hope to arrive at it by rejecting theories that appear to be false. However, refutations are themselves conjectural, so no refutation is ever justified either. Fortunately, there is a crucial asymmetry between a justification and a refutation. A conjectural refutation is coherent. It makes sense to say, if this observed phenomenon is a black swan, then all swans are white is refuted. Or, if this proof is a correctly derived inconsistency, then the theory from which it is derived is false. By contrast, a conjectural justification is incoherent. We could not observe all swans everywhere and everywhen being white, at least not unless we were God or some similarly pernicious entity. Nor could we prove the assumptions of an allegedly justifying argument without entering into infinite regress. It is also worth mentioning that much that is mistaken for justification is actually an explanation. For instance, markets allocate resources efficiently by people bidding for them in proportion to their profitability, whether monetary or psychic. That's not a justification of markets or libertarianism, but it's some sort of explanation. Such explanations may often be true or useful, but they are themselves conjectures and usually incomplete. How does this apply to libertarianism? It is a conjecture that it is desirable to allow universal interpersonal liberty. Libertarians think that this conjecture is not refuted by any criticism. All we can do is try to defend it by answering the best criticisms that we can find, and those of critics of libertarianism. Occasionally these overlap. What about rights? One might conjecture that rights to liberty are the best rights, and then consider criticisms. What about utility? One might conjecture that liberty is the main cause of promoting utility, in terms of the satisfaction of spontaneous preferences in particular, and then consider criticisms. I say might because neither of these views can support the universal theory of libertarianism, and because a defender of libertarianism might offer different answers concerning rights or utility or whatever some specific criticism happens to be about. The point is to attempt the possible, to refute the particular potential refutation somehow. For instance, genetic tests indicate that this alleged black swan is really a new species of goose. The point is not to attempt the impossible, to establish the universal conjecture. For instance, genetic tests show that every swan everywhere and everywhen is white. That's clearly impossible. In addition to that outline, I ought to mention the type of liberty that I assume libertarians to be defending. It is a kind of interpersonal liberty. In particular, it is about people being unconstrained by other people's interferences or invasions or aggressions or trespasses, or, as I prefer to theorise it, it is about the absence of proactively imposed costs, and ultimately in a pre-proprietarian sense, but more on this later. Therefore, when Bloch asserts that his deontological libertarianism is based on the non-aggression principle, there are two possible problems. The statement is fine as long as he means based only in an explanatory sense, but not if he means it in any kind of grounding or justifying sense, and I fear that he does. And he cannot literally be right to explain this as no one may properly initiate violence against another person or his justly owned property. For a thief need not use violence, for instance, when shoplifting, A shoplifter is not thereby a violent criminal, is he? And libertarian police may legitimately initiate violence against a non-violent thief if necessary. 2.1. Initiation of coercion. Bloch is outraged by the fact that Friedman starts off by attributing to many libertarians the view that it is always wrong to initiate coercion. Given Bloch's subtitle and first sentence, I initially assumed coercion to be his target. I also made that assumption because Bloch ought to be objecting to this first and foremost. Indeed, the expression, what he ought to be objecting to is indeed the expression initiate coercion. For just as with initiating violence, this cannot be literally correct. A thief does not need to initiate coercion, force, or the threat of force against the person. And libertarian police often do need to initiate it. Instead, Bloch objects to the words many libertarians and always wrong. In particular, he tells us that libertarianism is a theory or a branch of law, not morality. To make this point, Bloch supposes a libertarian, and this is where it starts to get interesting, who takes a job as a Nazi concentration camp guard.
As you do.
In order to save many people who would otherwise have been killed, even though he has to kill even more than he saves.
I think you should study my next book.
So as to demonstrate his bona fides and not to be killed by the other guards for dereliction of duty. Bloch says not only were his actions moral, they were heroic. But when he is brought before the Nuremberg court, will he be found guilty of murder? Of course he will. Though if the heirs of his victims forgive this hero, he will escape punishment. Bloch asserts, if these considerations do not establish a distinction, no, a chasm between law and morality, then nothing will. I like his confidence.
You've got no shot at your back.
Unfortunately, no. It is interesting that Bloch appears to be a utilitarian in some rather extreme matters of morals. But putting that curiosity aside, there are two main problems with his example. One, it is at best not obvious that the libertarian guard has behaved morally by murdering some people in order to save others. Many people would surely disagree. I'm not entirely convinced myself, and so the force of the point is weak and unnecessarily so. Two, the other Nazi guards were behaving in accordance with German state law at the time. Without going into details, and without going into details, the Nuremberg court is problematic as an example of libertarian law in action. These add further points of confusion at least. Therefore, let us consider a simpler example. Someone takes a car without permission so that he can ram open the jammed doors of a burning office block and rescue the trapped occupants. The car is destroyed, but the people are freed. Was his behaviour moral? I suspect that most self-described libertarians would agree that it was. Did it flout libertarian law? Yes, because he stole and destroyed the car and now owes compensation to the car's owner. So what does this show? It does not show that libertarianism is not about morals. It merely shows that morality and libertarianism can sometimes diverge in extremis. But that does not alter the fact that it is usually moral to respect libertarian law. Moreover, libertarianism is not a theory of what the law currently is anywhere. It is, at most, a theory of what the law ought to be, and thus libertarianism is partly a moral theory. More precisely, however, libertarianism is an ideology. Therefore, it contains both factual and moral theses. Broadly understood, these theses are that liberty generally promotes prosperity and is moral. In fact, law does not need to be mentioned at all. And if a society were to comprise only libertarian people, then, in principle, there might not need to be any law, at least if property rights are obvious enough. People would generally behave in a libertarian way, except for the occasional emergency where they would offer compensation. So much for the thesis that libertarianism is not about morals at all, but only about law. On the contrary, it is not inherently about the law at all, and it is inherently about morals, at least qua ideology. 2.2. Absolute control. Next block considers Friedman's assumption of absolute property rights, whereby Bloch quotes Friedman saying about carbon dioxide that if I have no right to impose a single molecule of pollution on anyone else's property, then I must get the permission of all my neighbours to breathe. Bloch's response: libertarianism is a theory of law, and a basic element of law in pretty much any of its emanations is de minimis. The law does not concern itself with trifles. As we have seen, libertarianism is not a theory of law as such, and there might not even need to be laws in a libertarian society. However, one can advocate libertarian law based on libertarian principles, and I do so myself. And Bloch does quite well to cite the de minimis principle as a response to Friedman. It is not a hopeless response. Ultimately, though, it does not deal with the underlying philosophical problem, as we shall soon see. Bloch then quotes Rothbard on this, where Rothbard concludes, conviction of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt appears to be the standard, most consonant with libertarian principle. I can only guess that Bloch means to imply that trifles cannot amount to guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. But that does not seem to add much. Bloch is more substantial where he cites Rothbard on radio waves, where Rothbard argues we must refine our concept of invasion to mean not just boundary crossing, but boundary crossings that in some way interfere with the owner's use or enjoyment of his property. What counts is whether the senses of the property owner are interfered with. There are two main problems with this. First, radio waves are objectively invasive of other people's property. They physically pass through human bodies and many other things. Therefore, this does not refine our concept of invasion. Instead, what it implies is that some invasions are to be allowed. Second, what counts cannot be whether the senses of the property owner are interfered with, because A, trespassing would be acceptable as long as no senses of the property owner are interfered with, and most libertarians would not think that even undetected trespassing is acceptable. B, damage would be acceptable as long as no senses of the property owner are interfered with, and most libertarians would not think that even undetected damage is acceptable. And C, some sense interferences need to be tolerated if liberty is to be maximised. More on this shortly. So what is the correct libertarian response? It is to have a more refined theory of liberty. In fact, it is to have an explicit theory of liberty at all. Many libertarians do not. I tend to say that people have interpersonal liberty to the extent that others do not proactively impose on them. But this is ultimately a pre-proprietarian theory of liberty. And so in the event of new problems or clashes of liberty, we can appeal to it to work out the best way to minimise any proactive impositions. It follows from this theory that people owning themselves is virtually always liberty maximising, because proactive imposition minimising. Similarly, ownership by use of owned resources, and after that by voluntary title transfer, are also almost always liberty maximising. I don't want to go into more detail here, so I leave it at that for now. How does this apply to the two problems concerning carbon dioxide and radio waves? If I prefer not to have either your carbon dioxide or your radio waves objectively invading my property, including my body, then they do proactively impose on me to some small degree when they do so. But for me or my agents, to prevent you from producing carbon dioxide or radio waves would proactively impose to a far greater extent on you, especially the prevention of your carbon dioxide emissions. And the liberty maximising policy must be to prefer the lesser imposition. Moreover, the imposition on me is so trivial with radio waves that any compensation is too small to be economic to collect. While in the case of carbon dioxide, any compensation is cancelled out by my own similar carbon dioxide production imposing on you. These then are the same outcomes as Bloch has here. However, we now have a relatively clear theoretical explanation of how they are libertarian. Furthermore, the practical outcomes will not always be the same as Bloch's preferred solutions, as we shall see. Super flashlights. Bloch then quotes Friedman's argument that absolute property rights against invasion could prevent us from having any lights where the photons would trespass on the property of others, because there is no difference in principle between a 1,000 megawatt laser beam and the brightness of a flashlight. Bloch objects that just because the colours of the rainbow blend into one another does not mean that we cannot distinguish extreme points at the end of this distribution, nor even all throughout. But Bloch's response is based on a misunderstanding. Friedman's point is not about the impossibility of distinguishing something that does damage from something that doesn't, because there is a continuum between them, which would be a version of the Sorites paradox. Rather, it is that absolute property rights could prevent things at the non-damaging end exactly as much as at the damaging end. And Friedman is absolutely right on that point. The correct answer to Friedman is that libertarian property rights are not absolute. They have to be modified where there is a clash with interpersonal liberty. And so, for instance, it proactively imposes on me significantly if I am not allowed to have ordinary lights on my property or must have perfect blackouts. But it proactively imposes on you to a tiny degree that my photons objectively invade your property. So the lesser imposition must be preferred. And there will probably be no compensation due, either because the damages will be too small to collect or because of equivalent invasions cancelling any claim. 2.4. Probability of risk. Bloch next looks at Friedman applying similar arguments to risk. He cites Friedman's comparison between playing Russian roulette with someone else's head and flying a plane with a very small probability that it might crash and kill people. Bloch thinks that imposing the risk of death, however small, Friedman thinks that imposing the risk of death, however small, on other people is incompatible with the right not to be coerced, stated as an absolute moral principle. Let us ignore both coercion as potentially confusing and morals as irrelevant to the real philosophical problem. We can then ask, is the imposition of a risk incompatible with libertarianism as absolute non-invasiveness? And the answer is, again, yes it is. But rightly conceived, libertarianism is not about absolute non-invasiveness. It is about minimising invasions. Where there is a clash, the lesser imposition is to be preferred, and any significant compensation will be due. In the case of compulsory Russian roulette, the proactive imposition is, to all practical intents and purposes, one way against the victim of the game. So this can be ruled out by libertarianism without any serious weighing of impositions against each other. In the case of flying a plane, a weighing is more plausible. It does proactively impose on some people that they are at an extremely small risk of being hit by a falling plane. But that risk is probably too small to be worth suing for. It would proactively impose to a far greater degree if people were not allowed to fly by plane. Therefore, tolerating flying is a liberty maximising or proactive imposition minimising activity. Bloch thinks that the problem is the word absolute. But that looks like a mistake, strictly speaking, for absolute is only really used by Friedman for emphasis. In non-aggression, the prefix non itself is absolute. The real problem is that property right aggressions or invasions or incursions or trespasses must sometimes be allowed because clashes are inevitable. So the simple principle of non-aggression or non-whatever cannot be sufficient. Rather, it ought to be interpreted in practice to include minimising aggression in the event of clashes. Put simply, non-aggression is what liberty is, and minimising aggression is the practical libertarian policy. Bloch has no adequate theoretical solution here. Rothbard is said to be right where he says, only if the radio transmissions are proven to be harmful to Smith's person beyond a reasonable doubt should Jones' activities be subject to injunction. But that cannot be right, for there could be detectable but insignificant harm that is outweighed by the huge benefit of radio transmissions. I conclude, therefore, that Friedman has put his finger on an important theoretical problem. The simple non-aggression principle is not intact and unscathed, as Bloch asserts. It has to be modified to deal with clashes. But once it is modified to include the minimisation of aggressions, invasions, etc., then the problem is solved and the answer is clear in principle. We do not need to rely on Bloch's relatively weak appeal to how it would be reasonably interpreted in practical situations. Homesteading. Thirsty work. Bloch next takes Friedman to task over homesteading. He particularly objects to Friedman's using John Locke as his target, for Locke is a relatively poor representative of libertarian homesteading theory. But Bloch then immediately asks, where did Friedman get the pernicious idea that land starts out belonging equally to everyone? However mistaken the idea is, and I agree that it is famously repeated many times, the expression in common 29 times, in Locke's second treatise of civil government, chapter 5 of property, where the chapter begins, God, as King David says, has given the earth to the children of men, given it to mankind in common. Bloch rejects as a fabrication Friedman's account of claiming or marking boundaries or loudly announcing that it is yours as a way of establishing ownership. Instead, Bloch insists on homesteading, which potentially confusing expression I take to mean initial acquisition. And the necessity that one has mixed his labour. So having insisted that Locke is a relatively poor representative of libertarian homesteading theory, the only clue to homesteading we are given is Locke's own labour mixing theory, when he takes something from the state that nature has provided and left it in and mixes his labour with it, thus joining it to something that is his own, and in that way he makes it his property. That's Locke, and it wasn't quoted by Bloch. Three questions occur to me. One, how does homesteading relate to a clear theory of liberty? For Locke is supposed to be explaining libertarianism, which ought to have principles explicable in terms of liberty itself and not ad hoc additions. Two, why a labour theory of initial acquisition? It sounds as anachronistic and dubious as a labour theory of value. Three, what if someone homesteads the sole natural water supply in a drought? Do others have to pay whatever he chooses to charge or go without water? and I shall help Block by attempting to answer these questions. It's just the kind of charitable chap I am. 1. Not very charitable to you, maybe. The reason that initial acquisition or homesteading is libertarian is that it strongly tends to maximise liberty, i.e. minimise interpersonal proactive impositions. Without it, we face the tragedy of the commons, whereby economising is drastically curtailed because people cannot help being a nuisance to each other. 2. Labour mixing is not a bad rule of thumb for initial acquisition. It usually works because when others, without our permission, take material things that we have made useful by our labours, then they significantly interfere with our projects and thus proactively impose on us. However, theoretically speaking, labour is completely irrelevant. If we simply start to use something that was previously unowned, then the imposed interventions of other people will be a constraint on our projects. No labour mixing is necessary. It can be sufficient that we are using the resources in question. Of course, without somehow establishing boundary claims, we are in a weaker position. For then it is often not clear what we are claiming or that there really is a pre-existing claim. Consider Block's assertion. If I place a fence around a square mile of land, I own the periphery, but not the inside of it. On the contrary, a fence might well suffice for the inside too, for I might have a use for keeping the land exactly as it is for a variety of reasons, as an investment, as a beauty spot, a sacred grove, etc. It would impose on me to require me to mix my labour with it, when that would be both irksome and reduce the value or even destroy it. But, we may suppose, I do not significantly, anywhere near as much, interfere with or impose on or constrain you in your projects by taking this place for myself. Strictly speaking, what is necessary is not labour mixing but simply using in whatever way, such that interventions would impose on us more than our ownership imposes on others. But in extremis, things might be different, which brings us to 3. It is generally true that allowing initial acquisitions will minimise the extent to which people are a nuisance, interference, cost, etc. to each other. For if natural resources cannot be owned, then economising for one thing is usually grossly interfered with. And I am not usually a greater obstacle to you by obliging you to find some other natural resources than the ones I am already using. On balance, initial acquisition, or propertising, as I sometimes call it, minimises interpersonal imposed constraints. But what if someone were to homestead the sole natural water supply? This might not normally be a problem if there were other sources of water, collected from rain, by desalination from seawater, imported, etc. But what if there were a great drought and no other supplies were available? Then it is in principle possible that the now monopoly water owner could impose more on other people by charging them high prices or denying them water than they could impose on him by requiring him to share the water, assuming there is enough for everybody. For he is, ex hypothesi, not the producer or the creator, or, we may suppose, even the preserver of the water itself, no matter how much labour mingling was involved. He is merely in the way of others who need the natural water supply. Therefore, the libertarian principle of minimising interpersonal proactive impositions overrides his ownership. Such extreme situations are undoubtedly rare, but they illustrate 2 things. First, homesteading is not inherently libertarian, or not in perpetuity and permanently. Second, the libertarian principle is ultimately pre-proprietarian. It should also be clear that extremely broad and uncontroversial interpersonal comparisons of imposed costs are ultimately inevitable with libertarianism, not only in extremist but also in ordinary cases. Otherwise, we cannot decide how to minimise proactive impositions when they clash. Crime and punishment. I'll skip a bit there. Bloch quotes Friedman's question: how in principle do libertarian moral principles tell you what degree of proof should be necessary for conviction and punishment? Bloch replies, the answer to this challenge is simple. Those responsible for punishing criminals are themselves responsible if they violate the rights of an innocent man. The people responsible for this miscarriage of justice are themselves to be considered criminals. And he quotes Rothbard at length to the same effect. The answer might be simple, but it is not a direct answer to the question as to what degree of proof should be necessary. It answers the question obliquely at best if it means convict and punish on whatever degree of proof you like, but you will stand to be convicted and punished yourself as criminals if you are mistaken. However, that cannot be the right answer for at least two reasons. First, some low degrees of proof would themselves appear to flout the liberty of the accused person. Second, to duly convict and punish an innocent man who one honestly believes is almost certainly guilty would be possibly tortious but not itself criminal. A more libertarian answer to Friedman and Bloch and Rothbard might go along the following lines. In the easy case, everyone involved, including the alleged criminal, will have contracted to accept the procedures of justice, whether beforehand or since the arrest. And any compensation that might be due in the event of errors. In this case, there will be a strong tendency for the market to produce an efficient outcome, all things considered. And that will include what degree of proof should be necessary for conviction and punishment, which might vary depending on the type of case. In the difficult case, the alleged criminal pleads innocent and has not contracted to accept any procedure. What should the court do? It should use its best libertarian procedures in good faith, and its best procedures will include what degree of proof should be necessary for conviction and punishment. Assume that it subsequently turns out that there has been a wrongful conviction and imprisonment. Then the innocent man is entitled to sue for full damages from the relevant organisations, which might or might not exceed what he would have been entitled to had he contracted in. However, it would be absurd to say that any policeman, judge or jailer acting in good faith and using the best libertarian principles were themselves criminals because of their mistakes. Extent of punishment. And I shan't go...
supplementary there.
Yeah.
Are you really insisting that they have to follow best practice at all times? That people...
Best practice...
You see, there's always documents published on best practice, and most people don't know about them. If you're innocent and you are held,
the best practice can include compromise because it's not an important case and we can always give him compensation if we're wrong. So the best practice can include the compromise. Best practice doesn't mean the perfect system necessarily. So I'm using the word loosely.
And if you're innocent, you know you are, and you're held in jail, are you wrong to absent you, maybe contracting the system to try and murder the guards to effect an escape?
It depends how long you're being held for, perhaps. I mean, but if you've been put in prison for a few weeks for some offence, then murdering the guards to get out might be a bit extreme. I haven't worked out every detail, obviously, of this general theory. Extent of punishment. So, not much more of this, and then we're halfway through, and I'll stop for this time. Bloch complains that... God, this beer's gassy.
Oh, he didn't?
And after that he said, Friedman's... is not at all an accurate portrayal of the libertarian proportionality punishment theory. When fully expounded, it consists not only of 2 teeth for a tooth, but it also incorporates the costs of capture as well as compensation for scaring. Bloch then elaborates a little and quotes Rothbard on the subject, as usual. He's Rothbard's rabbi on earth. My main objection, as usual, is that Bloch's reply provides no clear theoretical connection to liberty and is somewhat arbitrary as a consequence. A more libertarian response would go along the following lines. Liberty is the absence of interpersonal proactively imposed costs, or some similar sort of formulation. I don't object to any, I'm not addicted to any particular formulation, just the main idea behind it. Assume that someone proactively imposes on you, then you are due, in order to rectify the imposition, as far as is possible at least, full compensation or restitution. This should aim to make you no worse off than you would have been, ignoring various counterfactual complications for the time being. There are 3 main types of proactive imposition. 1, where the imposition is accidental. 2, where it is intentional or reasonably foreseeable. And 3, where it is intentional or reasonably foreseeable and there is an attempt to escape rectification. 1. In the simplest case, for instance, the imposer breaks your window by an accident that amounts to a non-criminal tort. He or his insurance company pays you for rectifying the proximate damage done, the broken window, plus more for any inconvenience associated with reasonable expenses. 2. At the next stage, the imposer intentionally breaks your window. This amounts to a criminal act in libertarian terms, as I understand it at least. Accidental impositions are not crimes unless due to gross negligence, but intentional or reasonably foreseeable impositions are crimes. If there was an attempt to escape rectification, then full compensation will amount to the same as before, plus an extra amount for any fear, as Bloch rightly mentions, or indignity, which Bloch overlooks, or any other additional imposition that you were caused. Presumably, the imposer could not be insured against committing a crime, as it is a choice and not an accident. However, there is now an additional factor. Because the imposer treated your window as though it were his to break, you have the option of doing up to some price equivalent damage to his property instead of taking the compensation. For that would not be a proactive imposition, but a reactive one. Yet, unless you feel particularly vindictive, there would not seem to be much point. For what you could not do in libertarian terms, despite the 2 teeth for a tooth axiom, is take full compensation and then enact retribution as well. 3. Suppose we add to 2 the attempt to escape detection. We now need what I call the risk multiplier. Let us assume that 1 in 10 people get caught for window breaking. In addition to the proximate imposed cost of the crime, there is now some cost of detection, both of these being multiplied in proportion to the imposed risk that the criminal will probably escape. Consequently, if we catch and convict a criminal, we are entitled as full compensation, in the case in question, to the proximate criminal damage plus reasonable detection costs multiplied by 10. For that is the only amount that will compensate in full for the imposed cost of the risk, while not going beyond full compensation. However, where the damages from crime is insured against, the insurance company will quite possibly pay immediately for any proximate damage and then own the full risk multiplier. Thus, crime should not be a good bet once we factor in the additional compensation costs of fear, indignity, detection, and any risk multiplier. However, the criminal is not being proactively imposed on. He is simply being liable for the full damage that he caused. Moreover, the option to take some of the restitution in retributive form now becomes more practical. But how far the victim or the insurance company takes this would be a matter of contracts and business efficiency. All this is only an outline of the libertarian view understood in terms of minimising proactive impositions and their rectification. But I submit it's far more clearly relates to liberty and the theory of liberty than the arbitrary two teeth for a tooth. Have I got time to talk about the madman?
You said a mouthful there.
A bit more.
You can go. Why don't leave this for next month?
Okay. If we,
He was wanting more.
that's too late.
It's too late for that. That's that 5 minutes. That 5 minutes is too short. Thank you very much indeed, Dan. Is there any questions or criticisms? Paul?
No, Walter Block certainly makes up in enthusiasm what you might like in philosophical skill.
Yes.
And
But he is an economist, so.
and this is the thing. And the other thing is, you're giving me a philosophical critique of an argument between two economists, David Friedman and Walter Block. So it's not.
Except one of them is saying.
One of them's a physicist, actually.
Yeah, well,
And he studied law as well.
Yeah.
but one of them is saying these are philosophical problems that I can't solve, and the other one is saying, well, I can.
Yeah. No, they're overconfident. And
Well, I mean, I think
one of the things.
David Friedman isn't overconfident because when I sent my replies to him, he said that he thought they were ingenious, but he wasn't able to either concede them or contest them because it's just outside his area.
Exactly.
Just outside his area of what he knows about.
Neither of them are sufficiently skilled in philosophy. Part of the trouble is, I mean, some of the errors Block makes are a bit silly. Like he insists that libertarianism is entirely to do with law and not morals, whilst constantly quoting from Rothbard's The Ethics of Liberty.
Yes.
To make this point.
Yeah.
Another problem with Block's, of course, is that well, it's partly a problem. It's partly a fault of Rothbard encouraging stuff. Is that they revere Rothbard so much that they don't seriously criticise him. In fact, in Block's case, he thinks that Rothbard's done all the hard work. Rothbard was very, very well read. He read everything. He might not have drawn the right conclusions, but he was a mass. He's certainly a genius in bringing it all together. He was a polymath, not necessarily the best in all fields. He brought a massive body of work together in a way that had not been done before. But Block, the trouble is, he thinks that Rothbard's done all the work, which is why he only ever quotes Rothbard. He hasn't read anybody else. It's not to say that Block hasn't.
You caricature slightly, but that there's some truth in what you say.
Block, and partly the trouble is that there's a slight cultism growing up around Rothbard, heavily promoted by the Mises Institute, where they find it very difficult to tolerate any kind of criticism at all, and they simply clam up or won't respond, and there are sort of certain cultish intellectual hoops.
Block gave me short shrift in a few email exchanges.
He does.
Block, when I did contact Block, and he gave me one round and a reply, and then I replied, and he said, "Well, I've told you what I think." Sort of, yeah. I mean, I actually very, very carefully replied to what he said. It just, no, I've told you. So,
Is it possible to praise Rothbard for getting the arguments going, not for saying, and he arrived at all the right conclusions? Just the fact is, he got them going.
So to a point,
you should criticise him.
On the other hand,
thank you.
I mean, on the other hand, there are anti-Rothbardians who seem to be unnecessarily harsh on poor old Rothbard, who is always very stimulating and full of things to
the
food
American
for
debaters
thought.
got bogged down in a lot of factual infighting, which is why they're so guarded about and why they just don't seem to be able to engage in it.
I'm in the fortunate position that both groups hate me.
They notice you then.
I just poke them enough for them to tell me how much they dislike me. We might get onto this at the end, next time. Yeah. So there are cultish aspects to it, but it doesn't have to be done that way.
No, it doesn't.
And in principle, I mean, and it varies from person to person, from Rothbardian to Rothbardian.
Yes.
But it means that in some sense they can't give the best defence of Rothbard that they could. Recently on libertarianism.org I was defending the non-aggression principle as, I mean, I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah, I did read it.
And, but I can defend it in a way that they can't, just because there's a sort of catechism of this is what you have to say and this is how you defend it. If you allow yourself to sort of roam a bit wider in your thinking, you can come up with a few additional ideas.
Yeah, they're too dogmatic about some of the precepts of Austrian economics and some of the... they rely far too much on Rothbard and Mises on a lot of these things. This is the trouble with
I'm not quite sure where I stand myself on these issues. I think I read quite a bit of Rothbard, and I'm a bit new to your approach there. But I have to say I like it a lot. I think it's great. But I'm not quite sure if I fully grasp all the elements of that your book.
Neither do I.
So forgive me if I ask a stupid question or if I misrepresent your position, but what I found interesting about your work is that a lot of libertarians now base libertarianism on either natural rights or, and then link to that property rights. Yeah. And I think what you show is that, sort of these property rights, if we take up property rights, cannot be absolute. There are situations in which you probably have to say something overrides your right to private property.
But then Bloch sort of agrees with that, but he says, let's be reasonable. But that's his answer is, let's be reasonable.
Yeah, but I liked your example. So if you take that example where people are in a burning house and somebody steals a car to break the door open, so clearly he violates property rights, the property rights of the car, or he damages the property to save people. Now we can agree that this is legitimate. But if I now take the position of a defender of the welfare state, just for argument's sake, and would say, okay, fine, here is a famine, so lots of people are starving, and here are millionaires, which I can tax to redistribute some of the wealth of these people. I mean, there's a similar argument to the one that you had on libertarianism.org with the bleeding heart libertarian.
Yeah.
And I think your answer was something like, well, I mean, obviously we shouldn't do this, we should respect property rights, because if we respect property rights, we allow a free market, that everybody becomes wealthier, and that, that solves a lot of the problems that we would usually try to, inadequately try to fix, provide redistribution. Is that fair to that point? But what I'm saying is that once you are at that point, and I think that's the problem that people like Rothbard would have, or that people like Bloch have, is that now, obviously at that point, property does become something that is up for societal debate, and because how far do we protect property rights, and how far do we allow other rights to override them, which I think is legitimate. And if I come to that point, I mean, in that point I would probably now defend Mises, because I think I always come back to Mises and these things, because Mises would at that point have no problem with it, because he would say property is a social invention. So
Mises
he
was a utilitarian. I mean,
and you would maybe not even a libertarian.
Utilitarian.
Utilitarian.
Yeah, he was a utilitarian.
He would be a utilitarian, and he would say your property is just a tool to solve society's problems. But there may be situations in which it's not the best tool. But once you accepted that, which you seem to accept as well, obviously you open the door for a lot of for property in many shapes or forms being questioned. And that, I think, is a problem that people like Bloch have with your position.
Yeah. I mean, for me, that's like skepticism. It's not a problem; it's a solution. I'm quite happy for it. They sort of think, well, if as soon as you allow that, then you're on a slippery slope to interfering with it in all kinds of ways. The Bloch's approach is, on the one hand, he appeals to the hero, and he does this throughout this. The person who ignores property rights and does the right thing. That's his one solution he's got. But then on the other hand, sometimes he is hardline property rights. So another example, which we might come to next time, is somebody hanging from a flagpole, and you're entitled as the owner of the flagpole to make them drop down, or if they try to get in to save their life, climb down the pole and get into your flat, you're entitled to shoot them. And that's most people would go on block as going a bit too far on property rights here.
Well, I mean, yeah, you can have the other example, which is, I think, one that Tom Palmer came once up with, which if you own a plane, you fly your plane, and suddenly you realise you have an illegitimate passenger on the someone you snuck onto the plane, and so he's on your property. Like, you can't kick him out of the plane, can you? I mean, to enforce your property rights. I think you would
with
say,
a parachute, maybe. But, because it's disproportionate. Any retaliation or compensation has to be proportionate.
Which Rothbard says.
Yeah. But I fully agree with you.
Yeah.
But I think that's very sensible. I think that and I don't think it means you immediately, once you make these concessions, you're immediately on the slippery slope to socialism. I do not think that's necessarily the case. But I do think clearly once you make these concessions, we all agree that property becomes now conditional. It's not absolute. It's a conditional. It's a social convention.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a way of talking people into libertarianism. It's showing how property is libertarian, rather than to simply insist on property rights without explaining how it is libertarian. And because then they just say they can't make the leap to the position. So you're, in a sense, there are pros and cons, but there are more pros in the sense it opens up the debate. But it's got to be the case that somehow property promotes liberty. I think it clearly does, because it internalises externalities and stops people interfering with each other. It's a very simple sort of account of how property does promote liberty. It's sort of so simple, I wonder why nobody else has come up with it, as far as I can tell, or nobody else has any time for this idea. If you ask them what's all this got to do with liberty or libertarianism, they'll start saying, well, rights, property rights, eudaimonism, they'll all talk about everything, but they won't talk about liberty. They simply won't discuss it. In the background, they do have a theory of liberty, but it's completely tacit, and they can't make it explicit. And I think the reason they can't make it explicit is possibly just because they sense there's a problem of a slippery slope. Because as soon as you say private property has a strong tendency to internalise externalities, which is libertarian, you say, but what if it doesn't? In those cases where it doesn't, perhaps it should be overridden. Maybe I'm going, assuming there's a bit too much thought going on behind their assumptions there. Probably no, they probably don't think that. But they would, if they ever did approach that, they'd see that as a risk, because we don't want to go down that alleyway.
So some years ago in Cambridge, a fellow PhD student, I think he eventually got his. I wasn't there to do it. I told him I was a consequentialist and libertarian. He said, no, if you're a consequentialist, you must be a sort of political interventionist, socialist, or or something. You just must. You couldn't.
That's what Bernard Williams. That's what Bernard Williams.
He said, you can't possibly think like that. I said, no. The slippery slope goes the other way.
Yeah.
You're going to slide down to my position.
Yeah.
You're on your high horse, and your horse with you. Because once we start seriously talking, I put it in terms of opportunity.
Yeah.
With myself.
Yeah.
And the debate is, and his position is also far from my own position, but I put it in terms of opportunity. What creates opportunities for happiness or welfare, or however you want to put it.
Yeah.
And property rights help, but there will be exceptions. There will be times for this. But if you're seriously concerned about opportunity or minimising imposed costs, which is another thing of cost, from the other end of the opportunity.
In the sense of not being constrained.
These people simply cannot see that could be a libertarian way of approaching it.
For Bernard Williams, it was, he never even considered the possibility in anything he wrote that, as far as I can tell, and I did write to him about this, that utilitarianism could have libertarian consequences. He just thought that was he didn't even conceive of it as a thought experiment. Yeah, that was what was so strange. A philosopher, you would think, in principle, it could. Well, obviously, it's nonsense. He didn't even say that. He just said, if you are a utilitarian, obviously you believe in all of this redistribution, and it's not obvious.
But notoriously, the laissez-faire advocates were utilitarians.
That's right, mate. That's where they come from. Yeah, that's one of them. We're liberals.
Yeah, well, there's many ironies in all of this. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to that, what you're saying is very fascinating, I must say, to answer some questions that I was struggling with. But it is quite intellectually complex what you're saying, and the problem is, if you talk to a lot of libertarians, they like exactly what Detlef is saying. This very simplistic approach of, there's property and you don't interfere with it, and they don't want to hear anything that there are some areas in which this might lead.
Well, I think it can be put in a simple way. There's a lot of complicated argument, but a lot of that is only necessary because there are people who are resisting the basic insight, don't want to have anything to do with it, and so they have a whole array of how they normally argue, and you've got to defeat all of their arguments to try to get to them. But in this libertarianism.org argument, where I talk about the non-aggression principle, I say everything I want to say I can say in terms of the non-aggression principle. It's just that rather than aggression being defined ultimately defined in terms of property, property has to be explained ultimately in terms of aggression. And it's really not a difficult point, I think, to say that to the extent that you own your body and other things, and thereby people aren't allowed to interfere with you, you're not being constrained and you are free. And therefore, property and freedom go together. I don't think that idea is that complicated. Yeah, it's just there are hard cases, in particular intellectual property, for instance. How does that fit into it?
Exactly. Intellectual property is the first time I realized that libertarians are absolutely keen in having a very simplistic view of law, because the fear is, in my persuasion, when I argue with libertarians about intellectual property, the fear is always that you establish kind of a case in which intellectual property might be legitimate, and then you have the problem that you have to find some kind of end to intellectual property, which of course there need to be an end to intellectual property. You cannot have an absolute right on intellectual property, and that's
another talk.
Yeah. But that's the first time I realized that people are just scared that you establish a kind of a case where you interfere with other people's property, and then you don't know where the end of this is. And I agree with you completely. We should probably go there and look at these things from a different perspective, because there are clearly problems that are not solved in the Rosbody view.
The reason they're not solved, as I say, is simply this: they don't understand that if you're a libertarian, liberty has to be the principle that's underneath everything else. And therefore you have to have a theory of liberty. And if you haven't got it, in some sense, you're not really a libertarian at all. You're a proprietarian. Now, I wonder why some of these people call themselves libertarians. Some of them, in particular, who say that they're in favour of sort of limited welfare state and all kinds of other things. They say, oh, but I'm a libertarian. And they even have a theory of liberty sometimes. But when you ask them what the theory of liberty is, it's something like Steiner's theory, that, well, if you steal my bicycle, then you have more liberty because you now have the liberty of using my bicycle. And I would say, that's crazy. That's not liberty. That's theft. That's license. And license is the opposite of liberty. But for them, it's all a zero-sum game. Which means, but if it's a zero-sum game, then you can't possibly advocate having more of it because it's zero sum. So that theory of liberty does no work. So either they have an otiose theory of liberty, or they have no, or more usually, they have no theory of liberty at all in an explicit form. I obviously think that they have this libertarian intuition that property liberates you because it stops people interfering with you. That short sentence sort of really encapsulates the idea, so I don't really think it's complicated. As long as you can get that idea into somebody's head, why property liberates you because it stops people constraining you, and not being constrained is to be free. If we get that idea into people's heads, then they'll flip over and stop going on and on about rights in particular. They're confusing several things. Firstly, they don't have a theory of liberty, and they want to talk about rights in particular. And rights won't do the job. But also, then they've inherently moralised what they're talking about. So they can't talk about, on the one hand, what libertarianism is, and then separately, whether it's moral. They've got libertarianism is inherently moral, if you're talking about it. Of course, not for Bloch, of course, because it's got nothing to do with morals. It's law. But that is a particularly strange, I think, idea that libertarianism is about law.
Yes. Yeah, just on what you've said. If I quote you correctly, you said property is important because it stops people interfering with you. Now, if, for instance, somebody crosses my lawn whilst I'm away, that person hasn't interfered with me at all. So you wouldn't mind, therefore, people trespassing, provided that it goes undetected.
No. Well, because I didn't put it, I wasn't giving a necessary and sufficient definition. Okay. I was trying to just get across the basic idea. But in light of what you said, I would expand it a bit to say interfering with your projects. In which case, one of your projects might be that people don't trespass on your lawn or your house, and so forth, and therefore, in that sense, any interference with your property interferes with your projects, or with respect to these things.
Well, not necessarily, but I mean, then Bloch's case of a flagpole is obviously an interference, in the sense that somebody is, I'm reading a book, and somebody is hanging at a window and is going to fall. I am disturbed in reading the book, so I should push that person. Well, then I would, so.
Well, I mean, I would have two major things to say about the flagpole example, which I do have to discuss next time.
Okay, but I don't want to preempt that.
Well, one is that you can't force somebody to die just because they're trespassing, because it's disproportionate to, maybe they owe you money for trespassing, but you can't say, no, sorry, you're on my land, I'm entitled to make you drop to your death. But the second thing is, I also think that there is I'm inclined to accept the idea that there's a right to self-preservation, which is stronger than a libertarian right.
Well, why don't we put it, I'm sorry, Paul, but I mean, why don't we put it in as a conflict of values? So, in other words, property is a value, but there are higher overriding values, such as life. And that goes back to the example we were giving earlier on somebody ramming into a house, destroying therefore the house and the car to save lives.
Yes.
So I wouldn't have a problem stealing bread if it is to save my life or saving my child's life. But then I should be punished in the sense that I have done something wrong still.
Yeah. So
if people, for instance, loot a warehouse in period of starvation, they are right looting the warehouse, But then, after being sort of fed and so on, they should be punished, whatever the punishment is, compensation, prison, you would say lash, 50 lashes or whatever, or gladiatorial combats.
Yes.
But they have done something wrong. They have done something wrong for the right reason, but it's still something that is wrong. It doesn't, the right reason doesn't exculpate them from having done, or exonerate them from having done something wrong.
I mean, one issue is what the libertarian solution is, and another one is it right or wrong? Yeah. And then maybe a third one is if there are two different competing principles here, you know, how do we rank them if we need to rank them? Yes, I mean, Bloch, as I said, he has this idea of the hero in some places, but he seems to reject him in other places. I mean, in the Flagpole example, you think a hero would point a gun at the owner of the flat or whatever and say, "Well, let him in," and then afterwards. But from my point of view, that's. I mean, it sort of is flouting property rights, but at the same time respecting it, because if afterwards you always pay compensation, you can say, well, it was a temporary flouting of property. It's not really setting aside the principle of liberty. If afterwards somebody is fully liable for any damage that they've done and they pay it, then in a sense you can say, well, I don't think I've really abandoned libertarianism here, because I insist that afterwards they pay their dues. And so it's just like
that's my comment.
So it's a bit like saying it's like saying that. And this is an example I gave with respect to Valentine. I said to say that no. If you say that, you're not. You've abandoned libertarianism. I said I think it's a bit like in football. If there's a foul, you shouldn't foul. If you do foul, then there will be a penalty or a sending off or whatever. But you can't say, no, you're not playing football anymore because there was a foul. It's not football. Well, of course it is. Football includes what you do when there's a foul, and libertarianism includes what you do when there's an occasional flouting of libertarianism. So I don't think if you abandon libertarianism when you say the right thing to do is steal the bread and pay the money later or whatever. Yeah.
Paul?
Well, yeah, I mean, in terms of proportionality of punishment, I mean, Rothbard entirely concedes this in the Ethics of Liberty. He says, if you're a shop owner, you can't shoot the children who are stealing the sweets from your shop.
But he has this double principle.
He says, Rothbard says let's take twice. I mean, how Bloch then thinks you can unscrew a flagpole and somebody's clambering along here, because that's, you can just charge them a fee for, you cannot, Bloch makes lots of this makes it. But again, for the other thing, they all talk a lot about morality, and none of them have a theory of morality either. It's not that they just don't have a theory of liberty; they don't have a theory about anything.
Well, one of the
they're all talking off the top of their heads. They certainly don't have a theory of morality because.
Yes, Bloch. He knows it isn't morals, but he doesn't know what morals is.
No,
but he knows it isn't.
Well, on the one hand, he says it isn't. Because he doesn't have a theory of morality, so he says contradictory things about morals all the time. On the one hand, he wants to try and tell us that libertarianism is the moral thing to do. Also, they want to try and tell us it makes us better off.
Well, does he say that's the moral thing to do?
They do, but then they also...
Does Bloch say explicitly, because it would contradict his... This paper was written in December. The one I'm responding to is just 2011. Oh, well, yeah, it's allowed. But I mean, its current position, I think, is that when it has been for a long time, libertarianism is a theory of law, and therefore morals shouldn't be brought into it.
Because what he wants to say is that libertarianism allows people to behave immorally. Because
oh, yeah. Well, that goes back to defending the unoffendable.
Because he wants to think, and his idea of the hero is this is somebody who will stand up for what's morally right, in spite of the fact he's against libertarian law and all. It makes no sense to you. Because what Block wants to say is the hero is the person who will steal the gun, shoot the madman, and then voluntarily allow him, like Jesus, to be nailed upon the cross for his sins afterwards. This is Block's idea of the hero. It's like some sort of demented version of the Christian myth. You know?
It's a very complicated answer that doesn't answer doesn't seem to give a theoretical
answer. And it has no persuasive force stuff as far as being interested in that. It just makes him look stupid saying it. I mean, for Rothbard, libertarianism was all about morals. Morals, the title of the book. He wrote all these economics books telling us how much better off we'd be as well, which says, as Bob always points out, coincidentally. It was all about morals, you know, as the view was, well, even if the free market absolutely impoverishes, it's still right for some reason. You know, what reason we don't. But Block's theory, it's not to do with morals. It can't be to do with making us better off, because that won't do us an argument either, despite the fact the free market does make us better off. He keeps telling us that, but that's not a reason for it. That doesn't count in his justification. It's a theory of law, but to what end? And he doesn't even have Friedman's idea that it's somehow efficiency of law. It just seems to be saying it's a theory of law to achieve what? Why not a theory of law that just says
to be fair,
you can kill who he likes?
though, to be fair to Block, most people are confused about.
Yeah, he is hopelessly confused.
No, well, I mean, even most philosophers. Most libertarian philosophers assume that either you're a consequentialist or you're a deontologist.
Yes, and you can't exclude one or the other.
Yeah.
You've got. I mean, it's a bit like this Kant's idea that there's rationalism on that side and empiricism on that side.
Yeah.
There's no one who's not both an empiricist and a rationalist. The human being can't achieve this divorce that Kant imposes, and similarly, they can't achieve the divorce between natural rights and utilitarianism.
There's a way that Block could solve that problem. I'm not sure he would take it, which is this: you have the general rules that serve for good consequences reasons. They serve human happiness, and then there are individual exceptions which are moral to take, even though they must be considered illegal by the best system of law. So that he would do something like that.
And then we uphold the law and punish the person acting morally.
Oh, yes, so he
Which is a demented thing.
And you'd be fined or something. So in other words, you're found guilty, but you did the right thing, therefore, you're...
Certainly it's a theoretical mess as a neat answer.
What he's saying is, if we all acted in accordance with libertarianism, as I advocate, we'd all be dead, shot, maimed. And all these moral people who are doing the right thing, then we should punish them for it. It's a position of absolute absurdity. And he keeps saying it over and over again in all the things he says. But it's not to say that he isn't without some intuitive. He knows he's got the right idea, but he's so loud and so unskilled in debate. And you only have to read the things he says to see how unskilled he is in presenting his arguments. So it makes him look stupider than he actually is.
Well, again, to be fair, he's an economist.
Yeah.
I know some philosophers who are worse philosophers than Block. So,
exactly, yes.
So
that's why I'm not saying he's bad. I think he's
Are you going to next one?
No.
He's real, and the fact that he says stupid things isn't obvious either. You have to look at it for 10 minutes before you can work out.
Yeah.
There's some people consider the Mises Institute a useful organisation.
Yes.
Please it exists, so there's more power to it.
Yes.
Now, some of them are obtuse and unsophisticated of necessity, but they're hard-working and not unintelligent and useful. Others may be capable of the sophistication, but say to themselves, look, we're building a mass movement. Right. And we want to have effects, we want to have masses in it. Therefore, we'll keep it simple, we'll keep it straight, we'll have one line, one approach. You can quibble about it, when you're off stage. But we'll just do it this way to get the numbers up. And there's something to be said for that. Something to be said for that. So I think some of them are just that dumb that they do think, that's probably right, that's it. But others may think, well, of course there are all sorts of things you could say, but we've got to get enough numbers up and keep people, money coming in, so we'll do it that way. Of course, there comes a point when you start deterring people who might otherwise have on your side, who will think, well, it's not as stupid as that. It's not just that. I mean, there are other ways of coming at this. So,
well, it's when they think that debating the issues intellectually and honestly and openly somehow clashes with the strategy they had in mind, and that for winning, winning people over, and you get these kind of conflicts. But it happens in all movements. There we are.
There are sophisticated.
Good, and
there are sophisticated Rothbardians, and is it George H. Smith? Is it George H. Smith?
Yeah, he's brilliant.
Now his stuff is much more philosophically sophisticated than Bloch, and worth reading. And
he is a philosopher, though, isn't he, George?
Yes.
I think he's a Rothbardian, isn't he?
He wrote something on atheism ages ago, didn't he?
Well, he's sort of a rando Rothbardian.
He wrote something on atheism around about 1960.
Yeah. Now,
Yeah.
I don't think he's being dishonest in any way when he puts the arguments,
No,
and he puts them in a sophisticated way. But ultimately, I think again they fall down for the same reason.
Yeah.
No theory of liberty. Well, two big issues, or maybe three. I'll think of another one in a minute. No theory of liberty. They're all justificationists, and this is the third one. They all think you've got to take sides over consequentialism and deontologism. You must be one or the other, and all three of these. And while they accept these three things, I think they're hampering themselves as regards propaganda, because propaganda is helped by the truth, and these things are false, and that's the main problem.
Yeah. I mean, there is a tendency of the media people as well and they do it on the Lew Rockwell side all the time. They want to accuse their intellectual opponents of being collaborationists with the statist regime. They can't simply have an intellectual disagreement, but it's the same. It cuts both ways. The Cato people there seems to be such animals, and it's the same. I mean, we've had a bit of it here, right? Various splits. I'm not quite sure what they're all about, but you only see the way that people get themselves worked up about these things. But you have to really back mouth.
But I think on this, the idea of the enemy is. In what way should liberalism have enemies? It's true that there are welfare statists and so on, but we don't treat them as enemies. We treat them, from an Enlightenment point of view, we treat them as ignoramuses.
But for instance, some people in the Cato Institute wrote some less than libertarian, some moderate positions. I can never quite work out this absolute obsession with guns that libertarians have. Maybe it's an American thing here as well. As though, taking your guns away is the worst possible infringement of liberty you could dream up. But there were some people said that we should support some moderate gun reform to try and stave off worse gun control. And the media people are going bananas. You look at these filthy statists sucking scum merchants in the beltways.
Well, when you've got something like an organisation which is with a man at the top, then you're going to get a line ultimately, I think, aren't you? And in a sense that we don't, because there is no one person at the top who says I decide what. With Lew Rockwell, you've got ultimately Lew Rockwell's in charge, and if he doesn't like you, you're going to be sacked. We know, we're not going to sack anybody. Rest assured, your job's safe.
We know that our friends Sean and Tim are for.
I think they come from a romantic point of view rather than an Enlightenment point of view. And Tris went in for this business of romance. He's too fond of Rand. And Rand's outlook is all the time she was looking for an excuse to fall out with anyone she associated with, which is a bit silly on the silly side.
There is a lot of intolerance with regards to differing views within the libertarian movement, although I do notice that.
Well, it's all this romantic point of view of the enemy class, the enemy. If we take an Enlightenment point of view, there is no enemy. There are people who don't know, or perhaps it's us who don't know.
But I mean, I think you can square taking a very, very critical, destructively critical approach. You put the boot into Kevin Carson quite well the other day, and you just putting the boot into it. But without it, you're not saying that these people are absolutely despicable, evil scum, but you're just attacking their
Yeah. Oh, well,
philosophical point of view. And then certainly in your case, in I mean, you use phrases like weak as piss, so on and so forth.
Yes, but that's just a bit of spice on the side.
Yeah.
I'm not saying.
Very unusual choice.
I'm not saying that I'm not willing to talk, to debate or talk with Carson, or is the enemy.
No, exactly. But these distinctions are subtle.
I mean, my position on Bloch is that often he gets it right, but the theory behind why he's right his theory isn't quite right.
No,
it's not that it's completely and utterly hopeless, and sometimes he gets it wrong, and again because the theory behind it isn't right. But I mean, generally speaking, of course, obviously, I think Bloch is doing good stuff. And a lot of what he writes, I say I go along with 95% of this. That's fine.
What do you think? Right. Is there any more questions?
I'm done.
Well, Bernd, then thank you very much indeed, Jan.
Thank you very much.